I mean, certainly reading the American war diaries and American reports of the time, they don't seem to have any clue at all that something pretty frightful was going to happen.
They're smashing through the Allied front line for a major offensive like the Kaiserschlacht of 1918. They're going to power all the way towards the Meuse. And somewhere along in that process, they're going to capture all this fuel, which is going to then fuel the tanks to destroy the divisions of the 21st Army Group and 1st Army.
The letter that's sent in unofficially, the army commander didn't know about it, saying, "We're completely surrounding you. We're completely overwhelming numbers, but if you surrender, you'll be okay." And McAuliffe was sort of, "What do we say to this?" And one of the staff officers said, "Oh, tell them nuts." And they actually wrote nuts and sent it back. And the Germans didn't really know what nuts meant.
Hello. On the morning of the 16th of December 1944, German artillery opened up a massive barrage before Tiger tanks, supported by infantry, began their attack across the front line and into Allied territory. In freezing conditions, US troops struggled to contain the advance, and soon a large bulge in the American defensive line emerged. In this first of a two-part special on the Battle of the Bulge, Gordon, Corrigan and Philip Blood joined to discuss the last major battle of the Western Front, as they chat freezing conditions, the bigger picture, German and US soldiers, Bastogne and nuts. Links showing these front lines are in the show notes. Please do subscribe or follow to get part 2, out next Wednesday. Coming up, I have Richard II and Henry IV. The film club is Apocalypse Now. And then we have another 2-part special on the naval history of Britain with legendary historian N.A.M. Roger. But until then, I'll hand you over to me talking the Bulge with Gordon and Philip. Gordon, Philip, welcome. Great pleasure to have you on to talk the Battle of the Bulge. Hello, Gordon.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hello, Philip.
Hello, good afternoon, both of you. Good to see
So,
you.
thank you. So today's episode is going to, and depending on how long it takes, I may split it into two because it'll be over the Christmas period. This is over the Christmas period. It's to keep the listeners happy whilst we're all eating goose or turkey or whatever it is you want to eat at Christmas. And so this is the Battle of the Bulge, which I'm reliably informed was basically the last major battle of the Western Front in the Second World War. And I say reliably informed. I'd known very little about this battle, so please do interrupt me if I get it wrong. There's no Cornelius Ryan book that I've managed to rely on. I'm only relying on Band of Brothers, and there's a Robert Shaw film, I think, where Robert Shaw plays a German officer. I don't know if either of you've seen that, but I'm pretty sure that's considered to be really bad. So
It
I'm going
was
off the knowledge of that. But why don't I stop talking and ask, would you start with Gordon? Could you just give a brief description of the significance of the Battle of the Bulge for the listener? It's not just another battle, is it? It's actually quite a significant clash.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the Americans were concerned, it was the biggest American battle on the whole of the Western Front in terms of casualties. But the background to it is the Allies have landed in Normandy in June 1944. Hitler, because of the coup or the attempted coup, is not allowing the generals to use their initiative. He's very restricted on what they can do, with the result that the Sixth German Army is encircled at Falaise and effectively written off. Paris is liberated. The 21st Army Group under Montgomery is going up to clear the Scheldt, clear Antwerp. The Allies desperately need a port because the further in they get, the further towards the German border they get, the further supplies, particularly petrol, oil, lubricants, and ammunition, have got to come all the way from Normandy. But they can't get the port of Antwerp until they've cleared the Germans out of the Scheldt estuary, which they do, and the Allied armies get closer and closer and closer to the Siegfried Wall. That's the defences on the German border. Montgomery wants a single thrust to Berlin to get to Berlin before the Russians, That's rejected. Eisenhower believes that a steady approach, a much broader front, is the way to do it. The question of the Ardennes, the Allied plan is to go either side of the Ardennes, 21st Army Group to the north of it, Americans to the south, because nobody thinks that there's any thrust or threat from the Ardennes, rather forgetting what happened in 1940. So the units, the American units in the Ardennes, facing the Ardennes, are largely inexperienced units, or units that have been made up with recruits, or units that have just arrived from America, or units that are there for training. And really, the war by this stage, at the end of November 44, has really come to a halt. Nothing very much is happening. The Allies have a logistic problem. The Germans, the Allies really don't really know what the Germans are up to. As far as the Germans are concerned, the Eastern Front is the big problem. I mean, on the Eastern Front, you've got over 500 Soviet divisions facing 200 odd German divisions over a front of 2,000 miles, whereas in the West, it's 85 or something Allied divisions facing 65 German divisions over a front of 250 miles. So the Eastern Front is what matters. So from the Allied point of view, everything's quietened down, nothing much is happening. Montgomery had got permission to go back to UK on leave. He'd stopped having his nightly situation conferences, and I think he said until the war gets more interesting. So everybody thinks, the war's going to be over in no time at all. The Germans are not capable at this stage of the war of putting up any major resistance. All that's going to happen on our front, on the Allied front, there may be local raids and local operations, but nothing very much. They're not capable of doing very much, was the general thought.
Okay. And so I think it's around about the 16th of December is when the battle begins. Philip,
Yes.
As I remember from my limited knowledge, I think the actual situation of the Americans, as Gordon's alluded to there, one of the main problems they had is they didn't have any winter clothing either, did they? And it was a very cold winter.
Am I talking for the Americans or for the Germans?
Well, you can talk about the weather and a little bit about the Americans and then maybe the Germans as well.
Because I don't agree with what Gordon said about the Germans.
What don't you agree with?
What's actually happening is there's a huge change taking place, a sea change taking place in German military operations. And it starts with something called Operation Lüttich, which is German for Liège. And it starts in the fighting in the area around Mortain during the Normandy campaign, where a certain general from the Oberkommando Wehrmacht is sent by Hitler to watch what's going on, because the operation is not very successful. The Germans are trying to counterattack against the American and British advance, split them up, force them back on the beaches, but hasn't got the power to do it. So Walter Vollemont, who's already been severely wounded in the bomb plot of the 20th of July, is dispatched by Hitler because he's the most reliable man on the ground. And he looks at what's actually happening and discusses with Blumentritt and Eberbach on this operation and tries to force the fight to continue, but they can't do it. And what you actually get happening is as the Americans break out of the Normandy pocket, they race up towards Aachen. So we're close to my subject again. Now, the situation with Aachen is, if you remember when we were talking on the podcast, Herbert Rink had broken into the city and stabilized the defense and pushed them towards more aggressive action to force the Americans to be continually committed to the Aachen area. Now, what actually happens is Rink gets out and he makes it home to the 1st SS Panther Division, which is then taken to Osnabrück for refitting in preparation for the operations that are going to take place in the Ardennes offensive. And what they're working out at that stage differently. So the SS are working out their military doctrine and the German army is working out its military doctrine for the coming battles, which they expect to take place in the area of the Rhineland. Now, in all of this, Hitler has decided that there will be a punch back, a push back against the Allies, forcing an issue. And the situation is, whether you believe what's been written, that Hitler was this loony who just wants to race to Antwerp, or whether actually there is a structure of strategic thinking taking place in the German High Command, which is basically the defender's dilemma. Now, what you have to look at in the strategic position of the Germans at this stage of the war is you first of all have the national security issue, which is Germany is about to be invaded, not just on the one side in East Prussia, where the Russian forces have already entered in October, November 1944 into Germany's borders, but you've lost Aachen on the 21st of October. So that puts a national security pressure on the National Socialist regime and holding power. Yeah. So you've got to hold power. You've got to keep in the fight. If you're going to fight the Nazi way, you have to hold on control of the country. So that's your first problem. How do you re-engage the population from believing that the war is nearly over to continuing the fight, to a stubborn resistance to what's going to happen later? At the same time, you've got a breakdown in military operations because you're fighting on 5 fronts. Yeah, it's all this. Well, it's on the east, it's on the west. You're actually fighting on 5 fronts because you've got the bombing, you have the anti-partisan, what's called the Bandenbekämpfung operations, which are taking place in Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia and Poland and elsewhere. In addition, you're fighting in Italy, Germany, or France, Germany, Belgium, and on the Eastern Front, and in the Balkans. Right, so it's a really complicated battle place that Hitler and the gang are fighting, and they have to make a decision now because your military-industrial complex is being threatened. The Rhineland and the Ruhr are both under threat from these twin armies, Army Group, 21st Army Group Montgomery coming swinging in from Arnhem, threatening from the north going through Munster. And you've got Omar Bradley's army, which, although it's making a mess in the Herkenwald, is threatening Cologne and going north towards the industry. So Hitler has to make a decision. So where's it going to be? Now, if you look at what all the generals say after the war, a lot of it's barely believable. If you work back on the documents and the way the Nazis think about the way they're going to run their war, it becomes very obvious after a while they can only go west. Yeah, because west is you have to defend your industrial base. West is where the Allies have already made a significant killing. But more importantly, Rink and the soldiers in the Herkenwald are reporting the poor quality of the American soldiers. So immediately that information is coming back into German military and doctrinal thinking, and they can see problems that they can take advantage of in the US Army. Because in Herkenwald, the Americans under Bradley have committed 3 divisions after the operations in Aachen. They've committed 3 divisions to the Herkenwald when they should have really committed 5. Those divisions have taken a tonking, and one of them, the 28th Infantry Division, is taken out of the Herkenwald and placed into an area called Bulge, which is almost in direct opposition, almost right in front of the 5th Panzer Army, which is going to burst through into the Bulge. The information that's coming to the Germans, the nature of the situation, the strategic position you're in, this battle has to be fought.
I think it's been a misunderstanding. I didn't say that the Germans couldn't do anything. What I said was that from the Allied point of view, the Allies thought that the Germans weren't going to be able to do anything, and that therefore there was no threat from the Ardennes. That's really what I said.
Yeah, because the Americans were completely taken by surprise by it, weren't they?
Yeah.
Were they?
Well, pretty well. I mean, they'd become obsessively reliant on Ultra. And of course, Ultra wasn't picking up anything because although they knew that German troops were being moved into the area, but didn't know why, they thought perhaps for retraining, perhaps it was for a thrust down to the south or whatever. They failed to twig that all these weather reports coming from more weather reports than normal coming from U-boats, that they didn't really work out what that was about. there was complete radio silence. So Ultra wasn't picking up anything. Everything was being passed by secure telephone or by hand of staff officer or whatever. And I don't think, I mean, certainly reading the American war diaries and American reports at the time, they don't seem to have any clue at all that something pretty frightful was going to happen.
I'm going to put a link in for the listeners so they can click on a map, I think, of what the movements were in the first, I think, 9 days of the operation. But the Bulge, it gets its name because quite literally a bulge of the front line from the German side bulging into Allied territory. That's the answer, isn't it, Philip?
Well, I mean, you've created a situation the Germans have created in a mindset of fighting, which is they're going to use battalions as a mass. Okay. So it's a difficult concept to understand, and it was always completely forgotten by NATO planners when they were forever using this battle as a panacea for the fight they were going to fight with the Russians in the Cold War days. But the actual thinking of the Germans at this time, which is really very powerful thinking, is they're going to transfer all their power to the fighting battalions at the front lines. Okay. So they can't match the Allies so much in material, and they can't match the Allies in sheer numbers, but what they can do on the fighting front is put more power into the fighting battalion to the battalion it's fighting against. Do you get that?
Well, no, not really. What is the power you mean?
So the fighting power is they're going to put more infantry, more guns, more heavy support into that point. And what you actually get are these Kampfgruppen and these fighting battalions, which have everything except for what they really need to keep them going, which is all the support troops, because they've filtered out the support troops to push into the fighting troops. So you have these fighting bodies of forces like Piper's Kampfgruppe, which have got this hard fighting quality, but they haven't got the capability to maintain the support. So very quickly, this Bulge, once it's kicked off, those first 3 days of fighting, it's going to make a great big sweep because they're punching against lightweight American forces. Okay. But there's two things also going on which makes the battle appear complicated. One is, in this National Socialist logic of theirs, you've got the army and the SS competing to who's going to get to Antwerp first. So the 6th SS Panzer Division under Dietrich, which is being led by Piper, is pushing out into a way, trying to avoid all of the hard defensive areas where the Americans, like, I can't remember all the names, but Team Cherry have put up defense blocks. And so Piper's going along with his heavy tanks, trying to find a great way, and he's pushing out. And this is creating the bulge as the troops are going out. So when they do meet German opposition, they pretty much can crush it, as happened in several of the units like those caught in Wiltz. In other places, they back round or avoid and take a different route from the American defences to push the Bulge out further and further. So you are taking territory. Right? At the same time, you're pushing all these fighting troops forward. So it's a very aggressive fighting stance that the Germans have applied to this operation. And then you get the rivalry turning up. You've got Jochen Piper, whose Kampfgruppe is pushing towards, at that stage, Trois Ponts and L'Église, which are, I mean, basically dead-end areas. Down in the south, just down below, on the left flank of this exercise, you've got the 5th Panzer Army of Manteuffel, and he's pushing Fritz Beyerlin's Panzer Division in a race, to get to Bastogne, because they've picked up that the Americans are going to put the paratroopers in Bastogne. So there's a 2-day race to get to this fight. So you've got Piper up there, Fritz Beyerlin down here. But the thing is, the Americans are not stopping to just be taken over. Initially, the 106 suffer some severe casualties because they get completely overwhelmed. And the 28th loses a lot of troops. But then the American soldiers suddenly start fighting back in local defenses. And it's those local operations which maybe hold up the Germans for only a few hours, but it's enough. And those help give time for the Americans to bring reinforcements into the area. And
Okay.
as we know, your band of brothers move into Bastogne.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions since Christmas is coming. Now back to the show. Okay, so Gordon, the first few days of fighting, is that when the Americans lose most of? I mean, I think they lose nearly 9,000 men in this battle, don't they?
They lose a huge amount, a very large number taken prisoner, and a lot killed in those initial periods. Of course, as Philip rightly says, the problems the Germans had was logistic. Now, Piper, I mean, they get about 70 miles. This salient that pushes out into Allied territory, it's about 70 miles from the Siegfried line. And the spear point, which is Piper, and people pay an awful lot of attention to Piper, but his spearhead gets to, I think it's Bullingen, and they capture an American fuel depot. That was their plan. They would capture Allied fuel. And great, and they refuel, and there's a number of cases later of soldiers being burnt to death because they're covered in fuel. So anything that sort of sparks sends them up. They then get, and I Stavelot they get to, and there's a huge Allied fuel depot there, which they're hoping to refuel. And they can't because the Belgians set it alight. It's being guarded by the Belgians, and they can't. And so they run out. And of course, the other thing that the Allies, the advantage that one would have thought the Allies had, was air superiority. But the weather is so bad for the first few days that the Allies can't use their aircraft. So the air situation is even Steven, if you like, although the Germans did manage to concentrate about 3/4 of the whole of the Luftwaffe's fighter strength, in case they had to keep the Allied air forces away from the head of the penetration. But in fact, the weather was pretty awful. But once the weather clears, of course, then the Allied aircraft do come into play. Piper runs out of fuel ultimately. His tanks, many of them he has to abandon. The other problem is, of course, the narrow little roads that he's moving along, which means that you've got a column of tanks. They're not deployed. They can't, in many cases, they can't deploy off the road. And of course, that's a lovely target for the air. So eventually, Panzer Army's thrust comes to a halt. The whole aim was they were trying to get to the Meuse. They get across the Meuse, but they couldn't. Whether it would have actually worked, I mean, Model didn't think it would. Rundstedt didn't think it would. They both wanted a much more modest operation. They didn't think that the Wacht am Rhein was realistic for all sorts of reasons. Interesting to know what would have happened if they had got to Antwerp. And I suspect not very much. Embarrassing, yes, but it wouldn't have forced an armistice in the West. I mean, I think what Hitler was hoping, that if they could inflict such a defeat on the Allies, on the Western Allies, or possibly even if they could inflict such a defeat on the Allies, or even I think they could a second Dunkirk, which again is pretty unlikely, that they could have had an armistice with the Western powers and then turned against the Russians. And I don't think by now they thought they could defeat the Russians, but I think they hoped that if they could hold the Russians, they could perhaps negotiate some sort of a peace. Now that was just never going to happen. I mean, that was absolutely pie in the sky. But I think that's rather what they hoped. And of course, as the thing goes on, the Americans initially are caught absolutely on the hop, large numbers of men killed, large numbers of prisoners taken, but eventually they do begin to get their act together. And they start to react. And of course, the defense of Bastogne, originally the Germans were going to simply bypass Bastogne. And then, as Philip says, when they realized that crack American troops were going to go into Bastogne. They thought, well, we better take it out.
Was that a
And
mistake then? They shouldn't have focused their attention on Bastogne.
I personally, had I been doing it, which I wasn't, and we have the great benefit of hindsight, I would have simply masked Bastogne. I would have blocked the routes from Bastogne, and I'd have carried on. But I was running out of fuel by this stage anyway. So, I think the Germans are up a gum tree, really, whatever they do.
And even if they got to Antwerp, Gordon, that makes me think that they would have been stretched so thin. Don't worry, Philip, not ignoring you. They've been stretched so thin that they wouldn't have been able to hold such a front as
Well, I think, yes, it would have been rather like if the British had succeeded in Arnhem, they could never have held that corridor open. Model would have simply cut it. And I think probably the same thing would happen if they got to Antwerp. And certainly the Allies were absolutely adamant that there would be no individual peace talks, that any surrender would be to everybody. So politically, it would have been unacceptable for the Americans and the British to agree an armistice without the Russians. I mean, that just wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, they had already agreed. Is it Tehran? They've already agreed that they're going to.
Unconditional surrender was what they came out with at Casablanca, I think it was. But right. It's simply not going to happen.
So, Philip, the tanks that the Germans are using, what's the matter?
I don't agree.
You don't agree with what?
Hitler on the 11th of December and the 12th of December has given huge speeches to the.
Yeah, what exactly? Yes,
sorry. What do you not agree with?
Just before we dive in, what
about the MERS? What the plan is?
I see.
Let's go back to the plan. And
the plan was to get across the MERS and get to Antwerp.
The mission is to get to the MERS, but you then have to look back at what the operational exercise is supposed to be doing. So
it's not Antwerp. I'm just thinking, just for my own sake. So, what is the absolute goal? It's not Antwerp, then.
You go. The aim is to get to Antwerp. That's the target. But you then have to look at what the operation is intending to do once it's got there. And what he has done is, first of all, he's given a speech on the nature of the way the war is proceeding. And that speech was recorded in Jodel's diary. So we know the speech, and we know that he doesn't really give a damn about anybody really but himself and the National Socialist battle that he's putting forward. But what he does is he convinces the German generals that this is a fight for the national good, if you like, the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community. And they go away fairly, as usual, we're going to win this because the Führer said we're going to win this. And what you actually find happening in the battle plan is the strike battalions, they're the ones that break through and push the Bulge. But what the plan intended to have was the large panzer divisions, the bulk of the panzer divisions, the bits that you're interested in, the 6th Panzer, the Tiger Mark 6, 2, and these vehicles were going to come up behind, and their direct aim was to destroy 25 to 30 divisions of 21st Army Group and 1st Army US. That was the aim. Now, whether that's realistic or not is neither here nor there. That was the aim.
But it's quite an important. I mean, like petrol. They don't have enough petrol, do they? So, or diesel. Sorry, diesel.
Well,
that's an important.
As Gordon has said, a lot of the plan was to steal the fuel on the way because they'd already committed to the idea that the Americans were not that up for it in this area for various reasons. It wasn't just the training troops. It was the fact that there were shattered troops coming from the Hurtgenwald. And they just assumed, given that they had this overwhelming majority of troops, it's basically looking at 1918 again. They're smashing through the Allied front line for a major offensive like the Kaiserschlacht of 1918. They're going to power all the way towards the Meuse. And somewhere along in that process, they're going to capture all this fuel, which is going to then fuel the tanks to destroy the divisions of the 21st Army Group and 1st Army. Now, we know, looking with hindsight, that's unrealistic. But if you listen to what the generals on the ground were saying in their recordings or in their reports, what's interesting is when they realize that the airborne troops are going into Bastogne, they immediately conclude that the Allies no longer have reserves in capable numbers to fill the gap. So that fuels Lüttwitz, who is the corps commander in the area, with Fritz Bayerlin, to push the two Panzer divisions even faster. So you get the 2nd Panzer Division and Panzerlehr, the so-called demonstration division of the Wehrmacht, to push through and go as far as they can. And they are aiming towards Namur. Now, eventually they pump into I think it's the British 29th Division or something. And or brigade, there's a bit of a fight there with British troops. But the aim and the purpose of the operation in the minds of the Germans has become something that they can realize. So we're looking at this thinking, well, blimey, you've got all these Americans and all these Allied troops, you've got all this power, you've got all this capability, and the Germans think they're going to steal victory from the Allies by stealing their fuel. That's a remarkable thing to think about. And to actually think that senior German generals in their 50s believe this is doable is even more fascinating.
But as you've both say, it was unrealistic. Obviously, they didn't think it was unrealistic, the Germans, but I don't think either of you are suggesting.
If you're in a defender's dilemma and you've got nowhere else to go, then your lost cause becomes your only cause.
Okay, so the American supplies then that they were going for, Gordon, were they? And I think you were clarifying. Is it diesel goes in the?
The German tanks were mainly petrol. Diesel was reserved for the German Navy.
I see.
And of course, the Germans have a big problem because they've lost Romania, which was their really only source of oil. So fuel's a real problem for them.
Before we started recording, we were talking about the kit involved. You've mentioned a few American units here, particularly around Bastogne. They sound like and I'm sorry, but Band of Brothers, they're airborne, so they're lightly armed, not much ammunition. But so these are sort of German tanks going up against lightly armed troops. Is that right, Gordon?
Well, no, they do get some armored units into Bastogne. There are a number of armored units into Bastogne, so they're not entirely. They're infantry heavy, but they have got armor. And what the Americans do is that they put blocks on the various roads leading into Bastogne, southeast, and they are reasonably successful. In fact, I mean, things like, and they're called after the command team Cherry Philip has mentioned, and that was started off with a company of armored infantry in APCs. But is reinforced as the days go on, and they were reasonably successful, largely because the only real access along the road, off the road is either forested or there's a great drop. So it's not as if the Germans have got much of an option. They've got to hang along this road, and this is where you get the thing that the Americans make a great thing about. The letter that's sent in unofficially. The corps commander, the army commander, didn't know about it, saying, we're completely surrounding you, we're completely overwhelming numbers, but if you surrender, you'll be okay. And McAuliffe was sort of, what do we say to this? And one of the staff officers said, "Oh, tell them nuts." And they actually wrote nuts and sent it back. And the Germans didn't really know what nuts meant. And I think they asked one of the American prisoners, and the prisoner said, "It means piss off. We're not going to do it." They make a great thing about that. But no, I mean, by then the Germans are running out of steam anyway. By the time they're trying to get Bastogne. And
roundabout, where are we in the? Is that sort of towards the end of December then?
Yeah, and
it's very cold, isn't it, Gordon?
It's very cold. It was something like 2 feet of snow. I actually went out when I wanted to have a look at this particular battle. So I went out on the 16th of December and tramped around, and it was about 2 feet of snow, and it was exceedingly uncomfortable and unpleasant. And I had modern kit, and I wasn't living in a hole in the ground. So yeah, it was pretty unpleasant for both sides. And of course, again, movement is a problem. Movement of vehicles is a problem. Roads get blocked and all that sort of thing. And a lot of the American units didn't have very much in the way of winter clothing. and there was a lot of indiscipline, units retreating, people dumping their weapons, dumping their kit, and that sort of thing. It was not good. But the Americans, one of the things the Americans can do, they can sort themselves out very quickly. They are very good at that. They'll take an awful hammering, but they'll react reasonably quickly, and that's what they did do. Philip mentioned the battle with the British. I mean, just to show how pushed the British were at this time for manpower, the 13th Battalion of the Parachute Regiment were back in UK on Christmas leave, and were told, cancel, forget the mince pies, you're going back, and they were brought back into Belgium. So this is when the battle starts to turn, and the Allies are starting to push the Germans back. But the poor old 13th Para, who took a lot of casualties, dragged back from Christmas leave. The Brits were really short of manpower at this stage. It's no wonder that the commander-in-chief, the Allied commander, Supreme Allied Commander, had to be American, because the American build-up, although the Brits had landed more troops on D-Day than the Americans, from then on, the American build-up would be much, much faster and would vastly outnumber the British contingent. So the British did get involved, not to the extent of the Americans, but partially.
Thanks so much for listening to part 1. The feisty chat continues on Wednesday, so please do subscribe or follow. But until then, thank you and good night.